All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a classic, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. This book came out way back in 1946, but it's still a big deal in economics.
It really is. Hazlitt spent over 30 years, writing for major publications like the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek.
Wow, impressive.
Yeah, explaining these complicated economic trends in a way that everyday people could grasp. And this book basically distills good economics down to this one simple lesson.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the lesson?
Think about the long-term effects, right, of any action like a policy or a decision for everyone, not just the immediate impact, for a small group.
So he's calling out those arguments we hear all the time that are like, this will create jobs, but don't think about the costs down the line.
Exactly. He's saying, look, those short-sighted arguments, they focus on who wins right away, but they completely miss the hidden costs. Those costs that kind of sneak up on you later. And he uses some seriously interesting examples. I mean, we're talking broken windows, wartime destruction, even big public works projects, the stuff that seems good on the surface.
Yeah, those are attention-grabbing for sure.
He really wants you to think about those ripple effects, the unintended consequences, the stuff that you might not see at first glance.
Okay, I'm ready to see what he's got. Let's start with one of the most famous examples from the book, the broken window fallacy. So imagine a kid throws a rock through a baker's window.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Now, some people might say at least the glazier, the window guy, gets some work out of it.
Right, like a little boost to the economy.
But Hazlitt wants us to ask, what's the cost that we don't see? The baker has to spend money on that new window instead of maybe buying a new oven or hiring another worker.
So it's not really a gain for the town as a whole, it's just moving money around.
Exactly. It's a transfer of wealth from the baker to the glazer. And what's scary is that this fallacy pops up everywhere, especially when we're talking about government spending.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Like, think about those massive public works projects, like building a fancy new bridge to connect two towns.
Sure, those are impressive.
Creates jobs, better roads, everyone's happy, right?
On the surface, yeah.
Yeah.
But Hazlitt would say, hold on a second. Where did the money for that bridge come from? Taxes, right?
Of course, got to pay for it somehow.
So, yeah, some people got jobs building the bridge, but others had to pay higher taxes, which means they have less money for themselves to spend on whatever they need.
So again, it's not really creating wealth, it's just shifting it from one place to another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like musical chairs. Someone's always left standing when the music stops.
Okay, that makes sense. And that leads us to Hazlitt's point about taxes in general. He's not saying all taxes are bad.
Right. We need them for basic stuff, the things the government has to do.
But he's saying we need to remember that taxes, no matter what, have an impact on how much we produce, on how much the economy grows.
Definitely. And especially when taxes are high, they can really discourage people from investing or taking risks, starting a business or something.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's say you're thinking about starting a business. Got a great idea, you're passionate, ready to go. But then you see the tax rates for businesses. And you start thinking, wait a minute, is this even worth it?
Yeah, if the government's going to take a big chunk of your profits, you might get discouraged.
Exactly. You might start questioning, if it's worth the risk, all the effort.
So high taxes can stifle those new businesses, prevent them from getting off the ground.
That's what Hazlitt's getting at. And it's not just businesses. Think about income taxes, the taxes on what you earn from your job. If a big chunk of your paycheck goes to the government, are you going to be as motivated to, work overtime or go for that promotion?
That's a good point. You start to wonder if it's even worth the extra effort.
That's the disincentive Hazlitt's talking about. And he's also not a big fan of those government loans to businesses or farmers.
Oh, why is that?
He argues that they often end up propping up inefficient producers, the ones that wouldn't survive without that help. And that actually ends up hurting the more efficient producers.
So it's kind of messing with the natural competition of the market.
Right. He's all about letting the market do its thing, letting prices and competition determine who succeeds and who fails.
Makes sense. Now, another big topic that comes up all the time is technology, robots taking jobs, all that. What does Hazlitt say about that?
This is where it gets really interesting. Hazlitt tackles this head on. He argues that technology, while it can cause some problems in the short term, people losing jobs, it ultimately leads to more production, lower prices, and a better standard of living for everyone.
So he's saying we shouldn't be afraid of robots.
Pretty much. He's saying we should embrace them. He points out that, there's not a fixed amount of work to be done. New technologies create new possibilities, new industries, and ultimately new jobs. I mean, think about it. 100 years ago, who would have imagined a job like app developer or social media manager?
Those jobs didn't even exist. But what about, like, the textile industry when machines were invented? Didn't that lead to people losing jobs?
It did, and Hazlitt acknowledges that. But he argues that in the long run, it actually led to huge job growth. You see, as the textile industry became more efficient, prices went down, which made clothing more affordable, and then demand increased. So they needed even more workers.
Ah, so it's a bit of short-term pain for long-term gain.
Exactly. And this same logic applies to all sorts of technological advancements. Think about the automobile. Blacksmiths and horse-drawn carriage makers probably weren't too happy about it. But it created a whole new industry, manufacturing, sales, repair, you name it. And don't forget about the impact on, like, people's freedom, their ability to get around.
That's a great example. So what about those schemes to, like, reduce work hours to supposedly create more jobs?
The spread the work schemes.
Yeah, does Hazlitt buy into those?
Not at all. He calls this another example that short-sighted thinking, focusing on what you can see, but ignoring what you can't. He argues that these schemes actually reduce how much we produce as a society, and that leads to less wealth for everyone.
But how can working less lead to less wealth? I mean, wouldn't that make things more efficient?
Well, think about it this way. If everyone works fewer hours, we produce less stuff. Fewer goods, fewer services, less of everything, which can actually lead to prices going up, not down.
Ah, so even if more people have jobs, they might not be able to buy as much stuff.
Exactly. And he uses specific examples in the book, like think about union rules in industries like construction or transportation. Some of these rules, they mandate less efficient ways of working to supposedly create more jobs. But if it costs more to build something or transport something, those costs get passed on to the consumer.
Right, everything gets more expensive.
Exactly. So Hazlitt argues that this ultimately harms everyone, even those workers the schemes are supposed to help.
So good intentions, but not such great outcomes.
Right. He argues that the real key to economic growth is increasing productivity, not just spreading the same amount of work around. If we can produce more with the same amount of effort, everyone benefits.
Okay, that makes sense. What about government price controls? Those are always in the news, especially when prices for things like food or rent are rising.
Hazlitt's not a fan. He's very critical of the government trying to manipulate prices. Whether it's setting a minimum price or a maximum price, he believes these interventions mess with the natural signals of the market and often backfire in the long run.
What do you mean by backfire?
Well, he used the example of government-supported crop storage programs. The idea is to stabilize food prices, right? Protect farmers from those ups and downs. But what happens is, when the government sets a minimum price for a crop that's higher than what the market would naturally set, it encourages farmers to grow more of that crop, even if there isn't really a demand for it.
Ah, so you end up with a surplus, way too much of that crop.
Exactly. Mountains of it. And then the government has to figure out what to do with it all. They might try to sell it at a loss, which costs taxpayers money, or they might even destroy it, which is just wasteful.
I bet he has something to say about minimum wage laws, too.
Oh, he definitely does. He acknowledges that the intentions behind minimum wage laws are good, right? Trying to ensure a decent living wage for everyone. But he argues that they can actually lead to people losing their jobs, especially low-skilled workers.
Wait, how could that be?
Well, he points out that if you set a minimum wage above what a worker's labor is actually worth to an employer, well, that worker basically becomes too expensive to hire.
So instead of helping, it might actually make it harder for them to get a job.
That's the unintended consequence he's warning about. And this can be especially tough for young people or inexperienced workers, those who need those entry-level jobs to get their foot in the door and gain some skills. If they can't get hired, they miss out on those opportunities.
So it's a catch-22. They need experience to get a better job, but they can't get experience without a job.
Precisely. Hazlitt also has some interesting thoughts about unions. He's not against them, but he also sees some potential downsides.
Okay, so how does he view unions?
He acknowledges that they can have benefits, collective bargaining, improving working conditions, but he's critical of some union practices, the ones that artificially inflate wages or restrict how many people can work in a certain field.
So he sees both sides of the coin.
Right. He thinks unions can play a positive role, but they can also harm both workers and businesses if they interfere too much with the free market.
It seems like he keeps coming back to this idea of letting the market work its magic, right? Letting prices and competition do their thing.
That's definitely a central theme in his work. He believes that the market, although it's not perfect, is generally the most efficient way to allocate resources, to decide where money and resources should go to create a thriving society.
Now, there's one thing that's always controversial in economics, and that's the whole idea of profits. Some people see them as a sign of greed, while others see them as necessary for the economy to grow. Where does Hazlitt stand on this?
He actually dedicates a whole chapter to defending profits, explaining why they're important in a free market. He argues that profits are often demonized, but they're actually a vital signal that tells businesses what people want and need.
So it's not just about businesses making as much money as possible.
No, it's more nuanced than that.
Hmm.
Hazlitt argues that when a business makes a profit, it means they're providing goods or services that people actually want and at a price they're willing to pay. And those profits then allow the business to invest in, new equipment, hire more employees, expand their business. That's what drives economic growth.
So it's like a cycle, right? Profits lead to investment, which leads to growth, which leads to more jobs and higher living standards.
Exactly. And he also points out that profits are actually a pretty small slice of the economic pie compared to other forms of income, like wages. He wants us to reconsider our perceptions of profit and to recognize how important it is in a dynamic, innovative economy.
It's like the fuel that keeps the economic engine running.
I like that analogy.
Okay, we've covered a lot, from broken windows to the role of profits. But there's one big thing we haven't talked about yet, and that's inflation. I mean, it's something we're all feeling these days. Prices seem to be going up everywhere.
Inflation is a big one, and it's something Hazlitt really dives into. He describes it as a dangerous illusion that creates this temporary sense of prosperity that can actually lead to, well, the destruction of wealth.
Okay, I'm definitely interested in hearing more about this, so let's dive into that in the next part.
Sounds good. We'll explore the mirage of inflation and why Hazlitt sees it as such a threat to economic stability.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how tricky inflation can be, how it can make you feel richer even while your buying power shrinks.
It's a real head-scratcher. When I was first learning about economics, inflation was one of those things that just, I don't know, didn't quite make sense. But Hazlitt, he lays it all out so clearly. He compares it to a mirage, something that looks real, but is actually an illusion.
Okay, so help me see through this mirage. What exactly is inflation, and how does it trick us into thinking we're better off when we're actually worse off?
Well, basically, inflation happens when you have more money and credit floating around compared to the actual stuff you can buy, the goods and services. Imagine you're at a farmer's market, right?
Okay, I like where this is going.
You've got 20 bucks in your pocket, ready to buy some fresh produce. There's a limited amount of fruits and veggies. Everyone else at the market has a certain amount of money too, and prices are pretty stable.
Classic supply and demand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now, imagine the government suddenly decides to give everyone an extra 20 bucks. What happens? Everyone's got more cash, but the amount of fruits and vegetables hasn't changed.
I bet those prices are about to go up.
You got it. Now those vendors can charge more because people are willing to pay more. Your 20 bucks doesn't buy you as much as it did before. That's inflation in action. Prices go up, not because the goods are suddenly more valuable, but because the value of each dollar has gone down.
So it's like everyone's rushing to spend their money before it loses even more value.
Yeah, like a game of hot potato. And here's where the illusion comes in. In the short term, when prices start rising, people might feel richer. Maybe their wages go up, or their house is suddenly worth more. But if everything is getting more expensive at the same rate, their real buying power hasn't changed. It might even be going down.
It's like running on a treadmill. You're working hard, but not actually getting anywhere.
Perfect analogy. That's why Hazlitt is so worried about inflation. It creates this fake sense of prosperity that hides the fact that wealth is actually being destroyed.
Okay, so we see how inflation creates this illusion of wealth, but what are the real dangers? Why is Hazlitt so concerned about it?
One of the biggest things he worries about is what it does to savings. We talked about how important saving is for a healthy economy.
Yeah, it's what allows businesses to invest and create those new jobs.
Right. But inflation really messes that up.
Hmm.
Think about it. You've worked hard, saved diligently, maybe building a nest egg for retirement. But as inflation kicks in, that nest egg starts to shrink. It can buy less and less over time.
Yikes, that's scary.
And it has a domino effect. If people don't trust that their savings will be worth anything in the future, they're less likely to save at all.
which means there's less money for businesses to invest.
Exactly. That can really slow down economic growth and stifle innovation.
So inflation hurts not just individuals, but the whole system.
Exactly. And Hazlitt also points out that inflation really distorts those price signals that businesses rely on to make decisions. When prices are stable, businesses can plan for the future, knowing that their investments will probably pay off. But when inflation's out of control, those prices become unreliable. It's like trying to steer a ship in a thick fog.
You can't see where you're going and might crash into something.
Exactly. So businesses get nervous about investing because they don't know what's going to happen. That hurts the whole economy.
So we've got this fear of investing, savings losing their value, and then what?
Well, there's another big danger. High inflation can really erode social trust. When inflation's high, it creates winners and losers, right? Some people might actually benefit. Like if you own assets that tend to go up in value during inflation, like real estate. But people on fixed incomes, like retirees or those on welfare, they really get hit hard.
Yeah, things get more and more expensive, and their income stays the same.
Exactly. And this can create a lot of tension, a feeling that the system is rigged. People lose faith in institutions.
So Hazlitt isn't just looking at this as an economic problem. He sees a moral dimension to it as well.
Absolutely. He argues that inflation is kind of like a stealthy form of theft. It takes away people's hard-earned savings without them even realizing it's happening.
Okay, so if inflation is this bad, why do governments let it happen? What's the point of printing more money or giving out more credit if it's going to cause all these problems?
That's a great question. It's complicated, but Hazlitt argues that governments often use inflation as a quick fix for deeper economic problems.
How so?
Well, they might think that pumping more money into the economy will jumpstart growth or create jobs, get people spending.
I can see how that might be tempting in the short term.
Right. And it might work for a little while. But Hazlitt argues that it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. It doesn't address the real problem and can make things worse in the long run.
So it's a risky strategy, maybe even reckless.
It can be. Once the government starts down that road of inflation, it's hard to turn back. It takes more and more inflation to get the same effect, and the consequences keep getting worse.
Okay, I'm starting to see why Hazlitt is so concerned about inflation. It's not just about numbers. It has real social and moral implications.
Exactly. He really emphasizes that the real solution is to have sound monetary policy, fiscal responsibility, and policies that promote real economic growth, not just artificially pumping up the economy with more money.
So we need to be cautious about those quick fixes that promise instant results.
Absolutely. We have to think long-term, consider all the potential downsides, and be skeptical of any policy that tries to manipulate the money supply to achieve its goals.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of inflation, but Hazlitt doesn't leave us hanging. He offers a solution, an antidote, saving. Let's talk about how saving can help us navigate this inflationary world.
Great point. Saving often gets a bad rap, especially in today's world where everyone's encouraged to spend, spend, spend. But Hazlitt wants us to rethink that. He spends a whole chapter defending the importance of saving and debunking all those myths about it.
Okay, I'm ready to hear what he has to say. How does he convince us that saving isn't just about hoarding wealth? And how does he respond to those arguments that spending is the real engine of the economy? Welcome back. We left off talking about saving and how Hazlitt really champions it, even though a lot of people think spending is what keeps the economy going. I mean, is saving really the right thing to do?
Hazlitt makes a strong case for it. He spends a whole chapter in the book dismantling those myths about saving and arguing that it's the real foundation for a strong economy in the long run.
Okay, I'm listening. How does he explain that saving isn't just, holding your wealth like some kind of dragon?
He starts by saying there's a big difference between hoarding and saving. Hoarding is like stuffing your money in a mattress or burying it in the backyard, literally taking it out of the economy. But saving, at least in today's world, usually means putting your money in a bank or investing it.
Okay, that makes more sense.
And when you do that, that money doesn't just sit there. It actually goes back into the economy and does some good.
So my savings account is actually working for the economy.
Exactly. Banks take that money you deposit and lend it out to businesses. Businesses use that money to invest, to buy new equipment, to hire more workers. That's how saving fuels economic growth. It provides the resources for businesses to innovate, to create jobs, to produce more goods and services.
So saving isn't selfish. It's actually an investment in the future.
I like that.
Yeah.
And to really illustrate this point, Hazlitt uses a great analogy. He tells the story of two brothers, Alvin and Benjamin. Alvin's the spender, always throwing parties, buying fancy clothes, living the high life. At first glance, you might think he's doing the economy a favor by spending all that money.
Right. He's keeping the money moving.
Exactly. But then there's his brother, Benjamin, the saver. He lives simply, invests his money, and thinks about the long term. He might seem boring compared to his brother, but here's the twist. Hazlitt shows how Alvin eventually ends up broke, while Benjamin's investments grow over time, creating wealth not just for himself, but for the whole community. His savings help to fund new businesses, create jobs, and improve everyone's standard of living.
So it's like the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race.
Exactly. Hazlitt shows that saving, even though it might seem less glamorous, is what leads to real, sustainable economic growth. And he also addresses another argument against saving, the idea that there's only so much an economy can grow. Some people say we've already built all the factories and machines we need, so what's the point of saving more?
Yeah, I've heard that argument before.
It sounds convincing, but Hazlitt points out that there's really no limit to human needs and desires. We always want to improve our lives, solve new problems, come up with new inventions, and to do that, we need investment. We need capital.
So there's always room for more innovation, always new things to create and improve.
That's the idea. Think about all the amazing progress we've seen in the past 100 years. Medical breakthroughs, incredible technology, faster transportation, instant communication. All of that was made possible by the savings and investments of previous generations.
So we're building on what they started, and our savings will do the same for future generations.
Exactly. It shows how saving isn't just about personal financial security. It's about contributing to the long-term well-being of society.
Okay, so Hazlitt makes a compelling case for saving, but he also recognizes that the world's a complicated place. What does he say about the challenges that savers face, especially with inflation always looming?
He doesn't shy away from those challenges. Remember how we talked about how inflation erodes the value of savings? Hazlitt wants us to be aware of that risk and take steps to protect our money.
So what does he recommend? How do we keep inflation from eating away at our savings?
He doesn't give specific financial advice, but he encourages us to be smart about how we save and invest. He wants us to understand the risks and look for assets that tend to hold their value when inflation is high.
Like real estate, gold, things like that.
Those are possibilities, but he emphasizes doing your research, understanding how each investment works. He also stresses the importance of managing your money well in general. Living within your means, avoiding debt, making thoughtful financial decisions, those are all key to navigating inflation.
So he's giving us a roadmap for financial responsibility, even when the economy is unpredictable.
Exactly. He wants us to have the knowledge and the mindset to make good choices, to protect our financial well-being.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into Hazlitt's economics in one lesson. I feel like I have a much better grasp of how the economy works, and it's amazing how relevant his ideas are even today.
I agree. It's like he's given us these timeless principles that can guide us through any economic situation.
He's challenged us to think critically, to look beyond the surface, to consider those long-term consequences.
And to remember that there are no quick fixes, no easy solutions.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the world of economics. It's a fascinating journey.
Absolutely.
And that wraps up our deep dive into Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.